So Dr. Sarah Wall is a sociologist and assistant professor in the Faculty of Nursing at the University of Alberta. Sarah has a passion for qualitative methods. As part of her doctoral studies, she completed a 2-year fellowship in qualitative inquiry at the International Institute for Qualitative Methodology. She subsequently became the educational director of that program and has since taught various courses and workshops on qualitative methods. Sarah has conducted and published ethnographic and autoethnographic projects and is currently undertaking research using interpretive description, discourse analysis, and narrative inquiry. Together with Dr. Alex Clark, Sarah is the editor of the International Journal of Qualitative Methods. Her substantive research interests pertain to the nurse's work and work environments, professions, and organizational ethics. So Sarah, thank you very much for being here today, and you can go ahead.
All
Okay,
right.
thank you very much. And I'm gonna make you the presenter now,
Okay.
Sarah. So you will be getting a message in a second.
All right.
Good.
The slides are a little bit cut off in my view of it might be okay. And yeah, it's a little bit cut off and I'm not sure how
Maybe if you
okay.
try to move the control panel, the GoToWebinar control panel, can you make an effort to move it to the side if that could help?
It doesn't want to move. Well, I'm going to just try it this way because I can see most of the slide, and if it's a problem, I'll let you know.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ricardo and Yvette. Okay, so we have an hour together today, and I will talk for about 40 minutes very quickly through really what's an introduction and an overview of autoethnography. There is so much to say about autoethnography, but we'll just touch on some of it to sort of get your thinking going about this method and give you possible topics to pursue on your own if you're interested in trying this more for yourself. So today I'm going to talk about the origins and definitions, just simply about autoethnography. Talk a little bit about how you do this, some of the methodological approaches. I'll share some examples with you, although there are hundreds. I'll just share a few examples with you so you can get a bit of a flavor of the possibilities with autoethnography. And because there is such a range of possibilities, there are also controversies around this method. So I'll talk to you a bit about what those controversies are and where maybe autoethnography might or should go in the future, or questions we have about that anyway. And then when I'm finished, there will be an opportunity for you to ask some questions to get more specifically at some of the details about autoethnography or dig a little bit deeper than this very quick overview will allow us. I thought that first I should talk a little bit about my autoethnographic work so that you can understand where I'm coming from and a bit about my experience with this method. My interest in autoethnography emerged probably about 8 years ago because I started to ask some questions about my experience as an adoptive mother vis-a-vis what I was hearing from the practice community about adoption and what I was reading in the literature about adoption, both from the practice disciplines and from the social sciences, and starting to wonder how my experience fit in with what they were saying, which didn't seem to me like it was a really great fit. And so I wanted to explore the interface between my experience as an adoptive mother with what I was reading and hearing about it. So I'll talk a tiny bit more about that project later on, but that was really the major autoethnographic project that I did. But once I discovered the possibilities inherent in what you might call personal research methods, I dabbled in it a little bit in other projects as well. One was a project I did with a colleague of mine, Irene Shankar, about transdisciplinary education. There's a lot in the literature about transdisciplinarity, but very little about success in working in a transdisciplinary environment. And we had a very successful experience in the doctoral program that Yvette mentioned that I did on qualitative inquiry. And so we did a personal narrative analysis on that experience. Also, I'd done some writing about the process of learning theory, which can be very challenging and difficult when it's new for you. And again, there's nothing in the literature about that that I could find. There's content about teaching theory, but not about learning it and the way that it challenges you. So I've written about that. And then as well, I've got a couple of methodological papers about autoethnography, because in doing, you learn a lot. And so I wanted to share some of my insights. Finally, I'm now, along with Alex, the editor of the International Journal of Qualitative Methods, and I'm also a reviewer for some qualitative journals. And so I see a lot of submissions and read papers about autoethnography, which gives me some insights into the sort of current shape of the field. So that's where I'm coming from as I say what I'm saying today. Autoethnography is an increasingly popular method. It has really exploded. It was already really coming to be when I discovered it in probably around 2007 or 8, but it is just growing exponentially. Tessa Muncy has a book about autoethnography, and in that she talks about how it's really grown. She just maintains a standing lit search just using the term autoethnography, and she's noticed a real growth in the kinds of publications that she's notified about through that search. That in the period between 1990 and 2002, she would get about 5 to 10 notifications a year about that. But since 2003 and onward, she's noticed more like 35 a year, and that's probably grown even since she wrote her book a few years ago. I just did my own quick little search this week, just in sociological abstracts. So none of the other databases, which I'm sure also have some content, looking at scholarly journals published only in English, and found quite a number of hits, most of them substantive autoethnographic works, not methodological. So in the 10-year period from 2000 to 2009, there were 110 hits. And from 2010 to 2014, so only a 4 or 5 year period, 114. So you can see the growth over time as well in the interest in autoethnography. And the topics are just about everything that you can imagine. People are talking about gender experiences, sexuality, race, discrimination, participation in sport or injury, illness, death, chronic disease, pregnancy, loss of pregnancy, loss of children, family, getting a PhD, doing research, and lots of different kinds of discussions about various work processes and work experiences. But that's nowhere near an exhaustive list. Just about everything you can think of is a possible topic for autoethnography. You can see, though, that a lot of the topics deal with situations that would be very personal and in which somebody might find themselves marginalized. And that is certainly a reason why people choose to use autoethnography for their projects. The term autoethnography itself has actually been around for about 35 years. It's credited to David Hayano, who published a piece about autoethnography in 1979. His article, though, is about what you might call sort of full member ethnography. So you are a participant in your ethnographic project. And in that, he explicitly says that he acknowledges but disregards studies which analyze one's own life through the procedures of ethnography. He says these studies are not only autoethnographic, they are self-ethnographic, but that they are not immediately shown to be applicable to other cultural members. So he's actually criticizing the idea of autoethnography as we currently understand it. Nevertheless, Carolyn, Ellis, and Art Bochner, who are kind of the gurus of autoethnography, use exactly the term autoethnography to describe the kind of work that Hayano calls self-ethnographic and the way that we actually understand autoethnography today. So we use Heiano's term, but we use it exactly almost the opposite of the way he was sort of intending it and defining it and describing its value. So there are a number of definitions of autoethnography, but they don't contradict each other, and here's just a couple of them. From Andrew Sparks, he says that autoethnographies are highly personalized accounts that draw upon the experience of the author and researcher for the purposes of extending sociological understanding. Or, as Ron Pelias says, an autoethnography lets you use yourself to get to culture. So this is still an ethnographic project. It's still about culture and all of the dimensions of culture that we understand from more traditional ideas of ethnography. But what autoethnography does is that it emphasizes yourself as the main topic of the research and your experience and how it connects culturally and sociologically. Autoethnography has lots and lots of different kinds of names for really similar work. There are probably reasons why people choose to use the term that they choose to use, and they have an affinity for a particular form of research, or they like the language around a certain description. But Ellis and Bochner have a chapter in the 2000 version of the Denson and Lincoln Handbook of Qualitative Research on autoethnography. And in that chapter, they have an almost two-page list of the possible terms that are synonymous with autoethnography. So here's a very select list of those, such as personal narrative, critical autobiography, ethnographic autobiography, personal sociology, autoanthropology, lots of different ways of talking about narrative, stories, autobiography, ethnography, and the personal, critical, self-reflective, and also evocative nature of that. But basically, this is the same kind of work that's done under different kinds of labels. So in the West, at least, we have a expression, a rose by any other name is still a rose. And I think that's true also of autoethnography. So autoethnography is, I guess, a predominant term, but it means all of these things. So what are the underlying values around autoethnography? Autoethnography emerges from postmodern thinking that challenges convention and tradition and positivist ideas in scientific inquiry. And it's based on the premise that there are many ways of knowing and inquiring, and that these are legitimate, and that no one way should be privileged. So it's not really meant to be a critique of or a dismissal of convention, but a challenge to it in the way that there's room for other ways of knowing and thinking about things. And these more critical, alternative ways of knowing and inquiring are ways that are very helpful in supporting work that's normative, that has emancipatory and transformative intentions behind the knowledge production. And you can see from that earlier list of topics that very often this kind of method is used to give voice to people who are vulnerable or marginalized in some way, or to those who have very unique experiences to which that allow them to contribute to discussion about topics from a really unique perspective. I think it's Laurel Richardson that talks about author evacuated texts, which in conventional academic writing we have a lot of. Third person writing, even speaking of yourself as an author, as the author, rather than using the first person and rather than having any of yourself in your writing. Autoethnography is definitely a challenge to that because it's all about you and your experience and your first person perspective on a topic of sociological interest. So, how do you do autoethnography? This was a real challenge for me when I was setting out to try this. There are a lot more resources now, more methodological articles, and some recent books that are really helpful, of which I have a list at the end of the presentation for you to see while we're talking. But a great deal of what's written on autoethnography is quite abstract or philosophical or editorial, and there isn't a lot of specific guidance about how you actually do it. Certainly you can draw some help from traditional understandings of ethnography and ethnographic methods, but this is a little bit different. So how does one set out to do this? Well, first, let's talk about data sources. Obviously first you have to have an idea, a research question and a topic that you want to pursue. But once you have that, then that's probably something that's just burning on your heart and already there inside of you to develop. So what can you use when you're using your own personal experience as data sources to collect and understand insights into your own experience that will help you put that together as a research project? Well, there are lots of data sources, and some of these are conventional, but some are different. One is that you can use photographs, video, or artwork. These are probably just personal things. These might be personal photographs, videos of your family, artwork that you've drawn, or even that someone else has done that represents your experience or somehow symbolizes your experience that you connect to as something that expresses what you wish to express. And so you can analyze those for what you see in those, who the characters are, what's not in those pictures. Maybe lay them out on a timeline and see what kind of a story is told visually. You can use artifacts. These could be family heirlooms. They could be things you have in your office. I'm drawing a blank, but we know what artifacts are, and we all have symbolic representations of things that are meaningful to us in our social contexts. It might also be interesting to think about how artifacts might not be interesting or useful to you. In my writing about international adoption, which is my experience, what was really interesting was that we didn't have souvenirs and artifacts of culture from my son's country of origin. And many people who participate in international adoption do have those kinds of things. And the fact that we didn't have them said something about how that was part of our family as we created it here in Canada. Other data sources can be writing. So these can be journals that you've kept over time, your diary, maybe even a blog that somehow functions as a journal for you. Poetry that you have written, that you write as you think about this project, poetry that someone else has written. Scribblings, notes, ways of processing your thinking by writing. Also, you can use self-observational data. Some of you will know about an older series of qualitative methods books produced by Sage in the 80s. These are little blue booklets, and one of them is called Systematic Self-Observation by Rodriguez and Rayev. And it's a cool little book about how you can take note of your behavior and responses to everyday experiences, and use that as recorded data. And it's a really great way of gaining insight into personal experience that could be really helpful in autoethnographic data collection. You can use social maps to lay out your own position and others' position in your social location and relationships among all of those people. Official documents like school or medical records, work policies, meeting minutes, government documents, anything that's relevant to your topic. Memory is also a great source of data in autoethnography. This is controversial though, and you will see people saying that you can't rely on memory because it's fallible and it's rewritten after the fact. However, for my autoethnography, memory was my primary source of data. And I justified that because ethnographers use memory and their own connection to the field as a significant source of data. And what Sanchez calls head notes, that is, everything you store about your ethnographic experience in your head, is actually important and legitimate data. Interviews can be another source of data. This is also probably controversial depending on your view of ethnography. If your ethnography is just about you and your experience, you may not use interviews because you're just talking about your own experience and drawing on these other data sources. But you may interview actors in your story, other people in your family, friends, people in your who are among your health professionals group, if you're talking about illness, or people who work with you, those kinds of things. Or if you wish to extend your autoethnographic project into interviewing other people with similar experiences, which some people do, you may also turn to them, people who are outside of your story but share some connection to the topic. You might turn to interviews with them. This is, again, not an exhaustive list. Anything you can think of that informs the answer to your question is a legitimate and helpful source of data. Now, data analysis in autoethnography, again, there isn't very much written about actually how you do this, but Chang has a book called Autoethnography as Method that she published in 2008, and in that is actually this list of strategies to use for data analysis, which I think is really very helpful in terms of framing your thinking about what you're looking for in autoethnographic data. Again, creativity is totally possible and acceptable here. And there are other people who would probably have very different ideas about this, but I offer this to you as one way of structuring an analytic approach. So she has a fairly systematic approach to looking through your autoethnographic data, looking for topics and themes, the kinds of things that stand out in terms of exceptional occurrences. And this would be really important in autoethnography because that's the whole point, is that your experience is an exceptional occurrence, and that's why you want to contribute this to the broader literature. You would look at things that are included or omitted from your story, a little bit of the timeline of your story, connecting the present with the past, who's in your story, yourself and others. If you've also included other people's experiences, you would compare your case with theirs and across cases. And then, according to Chang, you would also want to contextualize your study very broadly then and connect it with social science constructs and theories in order to make that academic contribution. Not everybody would see it that way, but this is a more systematic and conventional approach to autoethnographic data analysis. So once you've collected data, thought about it, analyzed it, responded to your own questions, the research question that you've devised based on your personal experience, what do you do with that then? The products of autoethnography can be, again, a lot of different kinds of things. They can, of course, be very conventional, standard social science prose, more academic kind of presentation of your autoethnographic research. However, there's lots of alternatives to that. People have tried fragmented, layered, experimental writing, writing that's presented more as a dialogue, even a conversation between different aspects of the researcher themselves, speaking in different voices. Just personal narratives and essays that aren't as analytical as convention might suggest. They can be very visual. They could be entirely photographic, but they could certainly just include a lot of imagery, images, video. You could write it as fiction, novels, or short stories, or even poetry. And there are examples of all kinds of these. If you do any kind of a search for autoethnography, you will turn up a lot of different kinds of examples of how people are presenting this kind of work. That leads us then to talk about autoethnographic styles. Autoethnographers, if you break down the word itself, can vary in their emphasis in different aspects of what this word represents. So auto is in reference to yourself. Ethno is the cultural connection, the sociological link to your question. And graphy is the application of the research process. So you could emphasize one of these over the other. You could balance all three of them, choose two of them that are important, whatever. And depending on how autoethnographers decide to emphasize different aspects of the possibilities in this word, that leads to the production of different kinds of autoethnographic texts. And we can interpret the word text very broadly. Autoethnographic work has been characterized most broadly in two categories, but categories, of course, are problematic, and there are lots of examples that would fall in between these or maybe not in either of these. But most broadly speaking, we can see two kinds. One is evocative and the other is analytic autoethnography. Evocative autoethnography is the kind of autoethnography that Carolyn, Ellis, and Art Bochner advocate for. It is very creative, narrative, confessional, emotional, therapeutic, highly unconventional. It is intended to connect with the emotional side of people's personal experiences and to be a real challenge to convention in academic work, to really open up how we think about research and knowing and knowledge and sharing that knowledge even within academia. The other side, if you wish to see sides, is analytic autoethnography. This is much more conventional autoethnography. It is descriptive and interpretive, but it has a very realistic tone. I put the word accurate in quotes here because the aim of the researcher here would be to be accurate factually and just more conventional in terms of presenting the facts and findings of the study. It would be a more academic approach to autoethnographic research as we understand academia more traditionally. So I want to show you a few examples of autoethnographic work that falls into these two categories. Although, as I said, there are many, many, many examples which you can go and look for yourself if you want more examples to help you shape an idea that you have, because really the sky's the limit. But if we're looking at these two categories, here's some examples. One that was very helpful to me when I started out was Andrew Sparks's 1996 paper called The Fatal Flaw, a narrative of the fragile body self. This is published in the Sociology of Sport journal. Interestingly, he calls this a narrative in this project, but in 2000 he wrote a methodological paper reflecting on the process of writing this one, and there he referred to it as an autoethnography. So you can see the shape-shifting that goes on in terms of terminology. Anyway, this is a story of his personal journey of being an elite athlete to a person who was struggling with chronic disease and disability because he had inflammatory back disease. that really interfered with and basically derailed his career as an elite athlete. If you read this paper, it's very conventional. It reads like a sociology paper. He uses conventional data sources, medical records, journals, conversation analysis. His paper is very theoretical. So while it is very much his personal experience, there's nothing about it that seems perhaps strange or avant-garde or challenging in terms of its format. It's very, very deep and rich and intelligent, and what you would describe, I guess, as social science prose. I include my autoethnography here because it's easy for me to talk about my own work. My autoethnography on motherhood and international adoption is basically just one story, but because it ended up being quite a long manuscript, I divided it and published it in 2 places. So my purpose with this was to offer a unique perspective on international adoption, but to do so in probably a more conventional way, just as in terms of introducing new concepts or ways of thinking about adoption, rather than it being an emotional project for me. I was described, it was described by one reviewer as dispassionate, and they meant that in a complimentary way because I wasn't being emotional about my experience, and therefore they saw that as beneficial and helpful to the broader community interested in adoption. So that's very interesting methodologically. My papers are very theoretical. The second one I have listed here, Rethinking Motherhood and Kinship, is from a feminist perspective, and it is in a book on mothering and adoption. And the other one, the ethics one, it incorporates some ethical theory and some post-colonial theory as well. So it's very theoretical, and it also reads very conventionally. The third one I have listed here is by Mishenko, Exhausting Management Work. This is published in a health management journal. So a pretty conventional outlet for the work, although that particular journal, Journal of Health Organization and Management, does publish critical work. And so she is exploring, from her perspective, the work experience of healthcare managers in the National Health Service in the UK. She does have some unconventional aspects to her paper, so it's moving away from conventional analytic autoethnography. She has some poetry in that, but the paper is still conventional in a lot of ways, and it's very theoretical. She draws on Foucauldian theory, and so for the most part it reads quite academically. Now on the flip side, we have more evocative and creative examples, and I have a couple here by Pelias. This is an interesting little paper. I really like it. It's very short, it's funny, and it's from his perspective on academic life. It's about 2 pages long, but it has probably about 3 or 4 periods in it. The whole thing is characterized by very, very long run-on sentences that kind of gives you a feeling of the monotony of daily academic life. And he throws in these half-hearted citations, so not even standard citations. He'll say something like, well, if I was going to talk about what Denson and Lincoln say about this and that, then I would say this. So that's how he handles citations in the paper. And you know, it's just sort of a funny, engaging piece that academics could certainly relate to. But yet there isn't anything really very academic about it, as we understand it conventionally. The other example is by Larison. This is a poem that is published on 1 page in Qualitative Inquiry. The poem itself is about 148 words. The abstract is about 120. So interesting that, you know, there's an abstract at all when it would be just easier to read the poem. But it's a reflection on her experience in a graduate qualitative methods research course. And so not analytical at all. It is just a poem about her feelings and perspectives on learning in that course. So very, very unconventional. So with this move toward away from convention and toward avant-garde and experimental formats in autoethnography come some controversies. Autoethnography is criticized for being self-indulgent, narcissistic, introspective, and individualized, almost going back to what Heiano first said about these self-ethnographic projects. It's criticized because some people appreciate autoethnography for its therapeutic value, and so it's criticized for being psychotherapeutic rather than a social science contribution. And critics note that it lacks systematicity and methodological rigor from a conventional perspective. But defenders of autoethnography say that really the voice of an insider, the person with the experience, perhaps has a more true and authentic voice, and they can speak of events and relationships in a way that just tells it potentially more factually and accurately than if it's inferred from other people's experiences. And those who advocate for unconventional autoethnography say that we shouldn't judge it according to traditional criteria, that it should be judged using literary criteria, and that the reader is the one who determines the value as they read it and connect with it. There's also some ethical controversies. There is always ethical questions to think about in all research and certainly in qualitative research. But autoethnography brings up some unique questions. You're telling a story, and as the teller of the story, you have power, but your story never is just about you. Everybody's story includes other people, whether they're central or peripheral characters, whether they're oppositional characters or important supportive characters. And so protecting the privacy of those people in your story and telling their story inadvertently is difficult unless you use pseudonyms, which also brings its own problems in terms of receiving academic credit for your work and being authentic about what you're doing. There's also the question of voyeurism and some of the topics that people write about. Society, as Ellis and Bochner say, has a perverse curiosity about private, damaged lives, and the extent to which an autoethnographer can contribute to sort of supporting that tendency for voyeurism is a question we need to ask. Arthur Frank says we don't just need to tell a story, but we have to respect the story, and in doing so it will shape the way we approach the telling of the story and help us deal with it ethically. We also have to respect our readers and their responses to our story. I found that in working with mine because I worked on it with the advice of other academics who did work in adoption, who were challenged by some of the things I had to say. And I had to find a way to say what I wanted to say respectfully so that the broader community of scholars around adoption were respected and could accept what I was saying. And then I just want to draw your attention to a discussion of some of the controversies around autoethnography that are published in the Journal of Contemporary Ethnography in 2006. And the basic question there is whether analytic or more conventional autoethnography is dead or alive. And so there's a series of papers in that issue where different people weigh in on the more conventional or the more unconventional side of things. So some say it's absolutely alive and that autoethnography shouldn't lose its sociological promise by devolving into self-absorption. for being too subjective and evocative. It needs to stick to its goals of analysis and theorizing. Whereas proponents of more evocative autoethnography say, really, it's analytic autoethnography is dead and we need to move on, saying that autoethnography is supposed to be unruly, dangerous, creative, rebellious, and break away from our understandings of reason and logic and create something really new that shows passion and life and the struggle that people face in their daily lives, and to be used as something that makes sense of situations that people struggle with. So that's a really quick overview of about 6 articles that are in that issue, but it really captures the tensions in autoethnography, its possibilities, what it should be, how it should be presented. And although that issue was published in 2006, I think those kinds of controversies and conversations are still very much in play today, and are questions that we need to think about and address. I'm not sure that we can answer them. And finally, I just want to offer you my perspective as an editor and a reviewer about some of the issues that I see in the things that people are writing about in autoethnography right now. Certainly, it's taken off and people see this as a high potential approach to knowledge development. There's some questions that I have about appropriate applications of it. So I have seen people use it in reference to just a reflection on the experience of a research project or something. And anyway, I don't know, because everything we do as situated in a cultural context, including our research. So there's probably not really black and white boundaries around the applications for it, but I think there's a question there in terms of, you know, when is it just self-reflection or reflection on a process of work, and when is it really an ethnographic project? Other questions are the value of that therapeutic aspect to autoethnography versus its sociological contribution. And this sort of relates to the extent to which the presentation of an autoethnography is a straightforward narrative, or how much it's analyzed and how much theory is brought into it. You will see a huge range there, and the critiques around autoethnography are about whether you can just tell a story and leave it to the reader to interpret, or whether analysis belongs in the presentation of an autoethnographic project. There are all those ethical questions that I've already talked about. And also, because this is an emerging new avant-garde method that challenges convention, there is a tendency for some authors to become quite defensive and even polemic, and what we would call sort of ranting, rather than presenting sort of well-considered advocacy for the method. And so I guess it's that respectfulness and some well thought out legitimation for the method. And I guess I wonder why there's such an explosion of popularity with this method. Certainly it gives people a lot of opportunity to speak into the literature where they don't see certain aspects of an experience represented. But I'm just curious, are there other reasons why this is becoming such a popular method? Chang talks about in her book how it's a very researcher-friendly method in terms of finding data and at least obtaining formal ethics approval, and so it can be perceived as easier to do, and it doesn't cost any money. So that might have something to do with it, but I just wonder why. So I think we can leave it at that. Very, very fast overview, and I've gone over time, but here's some methodological resources for you to look at, and I will turn it over to you all now to ask any questions or share any comments that you have.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And in fact, there is one question or two from the same person, Marisela. Marisela, I will give you the microphone now. so that you can ask your question. The microphone is opened. Okay, I don't hear your voice, so I'm going to read Maricela's questions, okay?
Okay.
First of all, she says, so far we have not heard about the issue of marginal status. Could you talk about that? And the second question that she asked was, how is this different from a phenomenological study that is of studies that try to get at the essence of an experience?
Okay. First of all, in terms of marginality, I'm not sure if she's referring to the marginality of the method or the marginality of the researcher author, but I guess I can speak to both. This method is extremely well suited to the presentation and analysis of topics that have to do with vulnerability and marginality. So often, I think people who are in marginal situations or who have marginal or experiences that are not part of the dominant discourse don't see their experiences represented in the literature. And so this is a great method for taking hold of that marginal perspective and considering it, analyzing it, and contributing it to the literature. If we're talking about the marginality of the method itself, it is, and it is marginal because of those criticisms from more conventional academics about the rigor of the method, the the degree of analysis in the method, and how it can contribute to the broader literature in a conventional social scientific way beyond the purposes of the therapeutic advantages that it offers to the researcher. So that's the challenge that autoethnographers face in terms of legitimating their method. The second question about the phenomenological approach, you will see in the list of other names for autoethnography that Ellis and Bochner offer in their chapter references to autophenomenology. And so certainly there's room for a phenomenological bent to this sort of work. However, ethnography and phenomenology have different purposes as we understand them in their traditional sense. And ethnography is intended to be culturally specific, writing about the attributes of culture and what we've learned about them. Phenomenology is about getting at the essence of a particular experience. So they have different purposes, but you can use yourself to study the essence of a particular experience as well. And there are blurred lines between the methods, and so looking at the essence of an experience can also be ethnographic. There is also methodological writing about this to explore this question further, but that would be my quick answer.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And we don't have any other questions so far, but please, everybody, feel free to raise your hands or write down your questions using the questions pane. And we have another one here. Let me
Okay.
see. Patricia, at what point, in fact, let me give you the microphone, Patricia. You are joining us from New Zealand, I believe. So let me hear from you. I'm going to give you the microphone now.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi. Yes. Look, I'm currently writing about some experiences with my own family members, being a nursed family member, I guess, involved in situations where family members are ill or dying. And I'm and there are other health professionals involved. And I struggle with the idea of at what point should we formally consent people
Yeah,
who are present in our stories.
yeah. You know, is that the end of your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. At the moment, for the most part, institutional research boards or research ethics boards in universities don't usually require an autoethnographic project to have formal ethics approval. When I did mine, I did ask for it just to reassure myself, but they gave it to me very quickly and easily and didn't raise any questions about the ethics of my project, although I had many. So we're really on our own here in terms of understanding the ethics around this kind of work. We are not required in a lot of cases or most cases to get formal consent from people. But I think in some cases, just to relieve ourselves of our ethical concerns, we should do that, and we should talk to the people that are part of our story and our autoethnographic project about what we're trying to accomplish and what what their part in it means, and make sure that it's okay with them that they're talking about that and that they're going to be part of this kind of project. It really is up to us, and the ethical questions are huge because we're writing this personally. The anonymity isn't there as it is with conventional qualitative methods where you can change people's names. You can do that a little bit, but it's just not the same in autoethnography. The chances of you know, putting someone else out there are much bigger in autoethnography. These are underexplored questions related to this method, and at this point they're mostly questions and they're left to us to deal with. There is, I believe, there's a new book, I think I have it on here. Stacey Holman Jones has this handbook of autoethnography that's just published by Left Coast Press, and I think there's a chapter in that book on the ethics of autoethnography, which would probably be helpful for some of those questions.
Thank you, Sarah. There is another question from Rosemary, and Rosemary, I will give you the microphone now. It's open now.
Hi, Rosemary.
Well, Rosemary, do you have a working microphone? Maybe not. So I will read the question for you.
Okay.
When reviewing an autoethnographic manuscript, what do you look for as an editor and reviewer?
Okay. Okay. I am probably on the more conventional side of things, although I really appreciate this method and the possibilities in it, and I don't want to close off those possibilities. I do tend to look at things with a somewhat conventional lens, and that's how I have also written my autoethnographic projects. So as a reviewer, I look for a well-organized manuscript. It can be very personal and emotional, and that's fine, but I want to see in that some explicit and overt connection of personal experience to the literature on the topic, and to theory, and I mean theory really broadly interpreted, just other people's thinking about the topic, so that the connection of the author's personal experience to the broader discussion about that topic is evident, so that the contribution that it makes to the literature is clear and it's there. It doesn't have to be assumed by the reader. However, as an editor, I look at things more openly than that, because I think in an editorial position, it's not up to me so much to decide where autoethnography is going, that it should be conventional. I leave that to the reviewers who review papers, and our pool of reviewers will include, or does include, people with different perspectives on autoethnography and qualitative methods in general. And so that there is more openness and the possibility for forward movement and evolution in the method than I might just see from my own conventional perspective. So I kind of look at it in two different ways depending on my role.
Thank you, Sarah. There is another question that is somehow related to that, and I'm
Okay.
going to give the microphone to Sonia. Let's see if Sonia can speak, otherwise I will read it. Sonia? All right, I will read it for you, Sonia. What is your criteria for evaluating the scientific quality and validity of an autoethnographic work?
Okay, well, I think that relates a little bit to what I just said in terms of just I want to see an overall analysis and connection to the literature. But I think in evaluating the rigor of any kind of research, we can turn to the same kinds of criteria that Lincoln and Guba criteria and just criteria about the quality of data sources, whether there's an audit trail. Sorry, I thought someone was going to talk. Just some of those standard criteria that we use to evaluate the quality of qualitative research.
Thank you.
Is there another question? Ricardo, do you have another question?
Oh, yes. Yes, there is one here, and I'm going to give the microphones to Sandia if he can or she can answer. Do
Okay.
you have I'm sorry, if you can ask your question? No, it's not working. So I'm going to read it for you.
Okay.
And the question is as follows. Are autoethnographic papers usually written post hoc, that is, as a reflective piece, or are there works where people design studies as utilizing autoethnography as a research method?
I have only ever seen autoethnographic projects that are presented as if they're complete, as a study that has been accomplished. The data has been analyzed, the connection has been made to the literature, and they are presented as, basically complete studies. Is that an answer to the question?
Let me see if Sanjay answers that. Uh, well, I don't have an answer from her or him, so
Okay.
I think it's about time. Maricela Oliva, who asked a question earlier, she's following up by asking
Okay.
if we're going to have access to the PowerPoint. Well, yes, you are going to have access to the PowerPoint, right, Sarah?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Yeah.
Yeah, and also you will be receiving everybody an email with the link from where you can download the video recording of this session, as well as the PowerPoint presentation. Um, well, I think we are finished now. It's exactly 1 o'clock Pacific time, and it's time for us to leave. Now, Sarah, if anybody wants to ask you a question, can that person contact you directly?
Yes, I would be happy to talk to anybody about this.
Okay, because we got another question here, and I don't know if well, it's about time to finish, so I cannot give you the question, but I will ask this person to contact you directly. Okay.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so thank you everybody for having joined us for this the second session, in fact, of this year of our seminar series that we do in partnership Atlas.ti and IIQM, and we hope that you can join us in our next sessions. The calendar is published on the website of the International Institute for Qualitative Methodology. So thank you, everybody, and you will be receiving an email from us with an evaluation form, as well as the link from where you can download this recording. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, everybody. But before I say goodbye, Yvette from IIQM, do you have a few words, final words to say? Yvette?
Hi, thanks, Ricardo, and
Yeah.
thanks, Sarah. Just want everyone to know that our Qualitative Health Research Conference taking place in Victoria, BC this year. Early bird registration is currently open right now. You can visit our website, iiqm.ualberta.ca, for more information. And thank you, Sarah, very much for your presentation.
Thank you. It was my pleasure, and thank you, everybody, for joining in.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.